All right, for the last video of this unit, we're going to talk about how one neuron will communicate with the next neuron in its path. So when we just talked about an individual neuron and the signal being sent from the dendrites of that neuron down to the axon of the neuron, that is called an action potential. But there are several neurons in a row that connect the sense organ to the brain or the brain to the muscle. And those neurons need to be able to communicate with one another. So this section is on the continuation of the nerve impulse between neurons. When you have two neurons that are next to each other, there's a small, very, very tiny area in between the two neurons called a synapse. And impulses are able to cross that synapse, which is the space between the two neurons, via neurotransmitters. And a neurotransmitter, like I said before, is a chemical that's released from the neuron's axon terminal. And they sort of congregate in the axon terminal until the action potential reaches the axon terminal. And at that point, the neurotransmitter is released into the synapse, and it binds with the dendrites of the next neuron in the line. So the dendrites of the next neuron have receptors on their surface that are stimulated by that neurotransmitter. And then an action potential is started in the next neuron, and this process continues until the signal gets to the brain, or from the brain to the muscle. And you can see here one neuron with its dendrites and its axon. You can see the arrows showing that the signal is traveling from the dendrites to the axon, and the signal sending is called an action potential. So the action potential is traveling down the neuron, and it reaches the axon terminal of one neuron that is very closely, not connected, but interacting with the dendrites of the next neuron. So if you were to zoom in right here, this is what it would look like, where this is the axon terminal of the first neuron, and this is the dendrite of the next neuron. You can see these little purple symbols represent the receptors. And what happens is the action potential arrives at the axon terminal. The vesicle that contains those neurotransmitters fuses with the cell membrane of the axon. Those neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, or the synaptic cleft, like we said, and the neurotransmitters start to bind with the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, or the receiving neuron. And when those neurotransmitters bind, they allow those positive charged ions to flow in, and then that sends that action potential down the second neuron. So it would continue the signal this way. So imagine this is the fingertip and the brain's all the way over here. You would have this action potential, neurotransmitter release, action potential, neurotransmitter release, action potential, the whole way to the brain, and then from the brain back out to the muscles. All right. If you want to pause this video, write down that link, pause the video, and watch that video. It's a good video to show what happens, what causes pain. I'm not going to show it right now for time's sake. I want to go into reflexes quickly. The lab you do, there's a part of the lab that deals with, not reflexes, reactions. Reactions and reflexes are different. Reactions, you can have quick reactions. Like they say in sports, you have quick reflexes. Those aren't actually reflexes. Reflexes are things that you can't control. Reactions, if someone were to throw a ball to you and you caught it quickly, that would be a reaction because your brain processes the ball coming at you, you catch it, you move your hands up, you catch it. That's a reaction. A reflex is uncontrollable. A reflex arc is the path that a reflex takes, and a reflex is a rapid, predictable, and involuntary response to a stimulus. So I'm sitting in a room right now, and if you could see where I'm looking, there's a window right in front of me. And I don't know if it's going to happen, but if I were to close my eyes and then open them, I don't know if you can see my pupils changing size. Close my eyes and then open them. That's a reaction if it worked. I don't know if it worked or not. That's a reflex. And what's happening is my eye is sensing an increase in light coming in. And that signal goes from my eye to my spinal cord, back to the muscles in my eye to make my pupil smaller to limit the amount of light that comes in. I can't choose to do it. It's quick because it never actually reaches the brain. It's predictable because it happens the same every time. It's involuntary because I can't control it. And the reflex arc is the direct route from the sensory neuron, which is in my eye, to the what's happening here? To the interneuron, usually, and then back to a motor neuron, which is the effector. The important part here is that it skips the brain. So my eye was just an example. Another example of a reflex, if you were to touch a hot stove and pull your hand back before you even realize that the stove is hot, that's a reflex as well. There's a stimulus. Here they're showing a pinprick. There's a stimulus. Sensory neuron carries the information to the interneuron. Interneuron processes the information in the spinal cord and sends the signal back out through the motor neuron to the effector. But this signal never travels to the brain. So your brain never makes a decision on what to do here. That's the difference between a reflex and a reaction. It never hits the brain if it's a reflex. And I said sometimes there's an interneuron. You can see in this one, like this is the hot stove example. It goes sensory neuron to the interneuron to the motor neuron, and you pull your hand back from the hot stove. If you're ever at the doctor and they hit your knee with this little hammer and your knee jerk reaction occurs, there's no interneuron in that reflex arc. It's just a different type of reflex arc. But same thing, there's a stimulus. The signal goes from that muscle, the stretch receptor in the muscle, up the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, to the motor neuron, to the muscle in your knee, and causes your knee jerk reaction to occur. And this asks you to find the difference. I just told you the difference is that interneuron, or the association neuron, that sometimes connects the two sensory and motor neurons together, and sometimes is not there. Okay, but the big thing with the reflex is it skips the brain. There are somatic reflexes that involve contraction of skeletal muscles. So that would be like the hot stove or the knee-jerk reaction. The reflex is involuntary, but a somatic reflex involves muscles that otherwise would be voluntary. So you can pretend to kick your knee out, like the knee-jerk reaction, even if it's not the reflex. You can control that. So that would be a somatic reflex. It's something you could control in a normal situation. An autonomic reflex would be like the pupils dilating. I can't decide that I want to make my pupils dilate. It's just something that happens. It's always involuntary. So that is an example. Pupils dilated in the dark is an example of an autonomic reflex. And I posted a video on reaction versus reflex. Might be helpful to watch before you do your lab. Just really quickly, 3 parts of the brain that I want to talk about. I don't have a picture of the brain, but I'll post a picture of the brain so that you can take a look at it. The largest part of the brain is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum, if you were to look, the part up here, the top of the brain, the big part, that's the cerebrum. The cerebrum controls your senses, your thought, your memory, your learning, some voluntary muscles. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. So it controls many, many things. The cerebellum is back here. The cerebellum's a little part in the back of the brain. It really actually just means little brain. And it's located at the base of the brain, and it controls your balance and your awareness of your body in space. So if you were to close your eyes and touch your nose with your finger, the only reason you know where your nose is without looking is because of your cerebellum. It tells you where your body is in space, keeps you balanced, gives you coordination. And then the medulla is part of the brain stem. So below the brain, sort of inside here, the brainstem starts to come down and connect to the spinal cord. The brainstem is about that long, and it has three parts, one part of which is called the medulla, or the longer term is the medulla oblongata. And the medulla is the part of the brainstem that connects the brain to the spinal cord, and it is important for breathing, which obviously is important. It controls breathing, it controls digestion, and it controls your heartbeat. So a lot of involuntary actions are controlled by the medulla. So we could do probably a whole other unit or more on the brain, but for the sake of time, we're not going to. I will post a picture of the brain with these three sections labeled. If you have any questions about any of this, please send me a message. Hopefully that was helpful, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.